Before we begin structuring the content of our Explore California site, I want to take a moment to explore some of the basic HTML structural elements and discuss how they should be used within your pages. There are two basic types of HTML elements: block level and inline. Block level elements are considered to occupy their own line within the normal document flow and are typically displayed this way within a browser. Block level elements that you might use frequently include the heading tags, paragraph tags, unordered or ordered lists, and the div tags that help divide content. Inline level elements usually occur within a block level element and are often used to identify content within that element. Common inline level elements include the strong tag, the emphasis tag, the image tag, and the span tag. So what do these tags do and why do we need them? Well, each of these tags have an inferred logical meaning, and they're used to identify the contents of the tag itself. The H1 tag represents a top-level heading, while text surrounded by an M tag represents text that is being emphasized. HTML has a wide range of available tags, but often there won't be a tag that is as descriptive as you need. In those cases, it's worth noting that the meaning of tags can be changed or expanded on as you begin to construct your pages. For this reason, it's very important to have a site-wide strategy for when certain structural elements are going to be used within your site. Will every page contain just one H1 tag? Or is there a reason to have multiple H1s across your pages? If you are dividing the site into regions like headers, sidebars, and footers, does each of those regions get their own H1, or do they start with a lower tiered heading? Well, in truth, it doesn't matter which strategy that you use. It just matters that you are consistent across your site. If you always use headings one way in your main content and one way in your sidebar, it's much easier for you to write styles that control them, and much easier for user agents to discern their meaning. Again, here consistency is key. Now that we've explored some of the structural elements we're going to be using on our pages, our next movie will focus on using Dreamweaver to define your document's structure. When designing a new page, one of the first tasks you'll need to do is to create the basic structure of your page's HTML. If you're typing in your content directly into Dreamweaver, you can add that structure as you type. If you're importing content from programs like Word, you can either preserve the text's structural formatting or reassign content to specific tags. Whatever approach you take, Dreamweaver makes it incredibly easy to add basic structure to your HTML. In this exercise, we'll take our resource file, which has been stripped down to the bare bones, and add meaning to the text by formatting it within specific tags. Keep in mind that in this exercise, we are focusing on the main content region of the page, not the layout or the secondary areas. The markup we would use for page layout will be covered a little bit later on. So here I have my resource file open from the 0502 folder. Now, it would be really easy to look at this file and say it doesn't have any structure at all right now, but that wouldn't be exactly true. If I click inside this first paragraph right here, if you have questions about an upcoming trip, you'll notice that in the tag selector, and this is that little status bar right down here below the document window, you'll notice that the tag selector tells me that this is inside of a paragraph tag. And in fact, if I click on the paragraph tag, it selects all of the text. Now, if I begin typing and I hit enter, so if I hit enter or return and I go down the next line and type in "this is a new paragraph," indeed, looking down at the tag selector, I do have a new paragraph. So Dreamweaver will place the previous line inside of a paragraph tag and create a brand new empty paragraph to hold the next line. Now, don't just assume that if you see a line of text that it is in a paragraph. Notice the first line of text here. When you click inside of it, you can see, looking at the tag selector, that it's not tagged. It's just sitting there in the body tag. This is even more obvious if I switch over to code view. You can see that while everybody else has opening and closing paragraph tags, which identifies the content inside of it as belonging to a paragraph, this headline, "Got Questions," is inside no tags. Now, that's really, really important. Within an HTML document, all content must be tagged so that user agents know what type of content it is. Now, that's really important. Within an HTML document, all content must be tagged so that the user agents know what type of content is contained within the tags. Now, with this in mind, let's restructure our page using Dreamweaver's Property Inspector. Now, I'm going to change my view a little bit. I'm going to click on the split screen view so that my code is on the left-hand side and my design view is on the right-hand side. you can grab the little dividing bar between them and allow more room for your design view or more room for your code view, whichever one you're currently interested in. Now, whichever one of these windows that you click in, that's the one you're currently focused on. So if I click inside the code, I'd be working in my code view. If I click inside my design view, I'm working in my design view. So what this allows us to do, let's say you're somebody that's brand new to Dreamweaver and you've never worked with HTML before, you can make changes in the design view. And just to the left of you, you can see what changes that you're actually making to your code. This is a great way to learn how to structure your content and which tags are being added as you create or import content in. So it's a really nice way of working. The other thing that this does for you is it reinforces the concept that you're creating code. If you work just in design view and you're brand new to Dreamweaver, you might get the mistaken impression that you're almost working in a word processor. I think it's really important for you to understand that everything that you do in Dreamweaver is in fact generating code. Okay, well, let's do some structuring here. I'm going to click inside the headline Got Questions over here in the design pane. I'm going to go down to my properties inspector, and of the two tabs, I'm going to make sure that I've clicked the HTML tab, because remember, we want to change the HTML structure. I'm going to grab the format pull-down menu, and I can see a listing of all the tags that I can choose from here. I've got my paragraph, all of my headings, and this little odd choice called pre-formatted. I get asked about that a lot. Well, what that actually is it wraps the content in a pre-tag, which causes browsers to display the text in a monospace font and retain any line breaks or white space within the text. It's really good for displaying computer code or scripting examples, and that's what it's primarily used for. In this instance, however, we want a heading 1 for our Got Questions. So I go ahead and choose that. Notice that in the design view, it gets bigger, it's bolder, and over there in the code view, it's surrounded by an opening and a closing H1 tag. So that is exactly what we want. We have a few other headings to structure, so let's go ahead and take care of those. Now, I'm going to get rid of my This is a new paragraph. I don't need that. So I'm going to highlight that and then hit delete and then hit delete again to get rid of the paragraph. You'll notice that the first time I deleted it, I just deleted the content of the paragraph and not the tag itself. So now I'm going to click inside General Tour Information, and using my Format pull-down menu, I'm going to make that a heading 2. So it's sort of a secondary or subheading. Now I'll click into Customer Notifications. I'll make that heading 3, and then I'm just going to scroll down my page, and for each of the other headings, Tour Voucher, Trip Planning, all those guys are going to be heading 3s. So H3s. Tour Checklist is going to be a heading 3 as well. Now I've got some more content underneath here that we're going to need to structure, but we'll be doing that in our next movie. Now as we structure our headings, we've used a very logical progression. H1, then H2, and then H3s. Now you might infer from this that you always should go in that order, but the truth is you can use any approach you want to structuring your content. In the Explore California site, each main content region will have one H1 tag that identifies the content. Any other main headings will be assigned as H2s, and any paragraph subheadings will be H3s. You're certainly free to develop your own strategy for your content. Just make it logical and be consistent with how you use it. By coming up with a logical structural framework early on, you can ensure that all of your pages use a consistent structure throughout your site. That makes the content easier for user agents to parse and easier for you to style. Now we're almost done, but there's just a couple more things we need to do here before we can move on. So far we've been using block level elements, headings and paragraphs. Now we need to use some inline level elements to add structure within the paragraphs themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the second paragraph here, Customer Notifications, and there are a couple of items in there that I really want to stand out to the user. For example, tour confirmation. I want them to know that they really ought to be looking for a tour confirmation that this is an important article. So I'm going to highlight the text tour confirmation. And again, using the properties inspector, I'm going to click the B tag, which indeed it says bold. Now, it's true that browsers will render that text as bold, but in reality, what we've done is we've surrounded that text with an opening and a closing strong tag. Strong tags strongly emphasize text, so any user agent will make sure that this text stands out. Next, we need to do the same thing to reminder notifications. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight reminder notification, click the B tag, and surround it with a strong tag as well. Now, there's another line in this paragraph that I want to make sure people are paying attention to as well. This sentence right here, if you do not receive a confirmation within 24 hours or the reminder for notification 2 weeks out, contact us immediately. All right, I'm going to highlight that and click the I tag. So what does that italic icon do? It surrounds text with an M tag, an opening and a closing M tag. So what's the difference? Well, the M tag is an emphasis tag, and it denotes text that is being emphasized. The strong text denotes text that is being strongly emphasized. So if you're looking for the logical structural definition of that, that's what it is. We've got one more. Let's scroll down just a little bit more down to our trip planning. And I've got a sentence here that says a list of any required equipment for the tour that is not provided by Explore California. I want to emphasize that point. So I'm just going to highlight not provided and click the I tag there as well to just emphasize that text too. Cool. Now our page is on its way, but structurally it's not quite done yet. In our next exercise, we're going to explore another fundamental structural element as we work with lists. Most people think of lists as simply a way of displaying related items in a numbered or unordered listing. Now, that's certainly true, but lists can do so much more than that. Lists allow us to group related content together and then structure that content in a way that denotes importance, rank, or similarity. When used for navigation, lists offer a way to group links together so that user agents know that those links are all related. HTML offers us three main types of lists: ordered, unordered, and definition lists. Ordered lists use some type of a numbering system, numbers, letters, Roman numerals, to display the listed items. Unordered lists use bullets or icons to denote a listed item, and definition lists display a term followed by a definition. While ordered lists and unordered lists follow the same basic structure, definition lists use a slightly different structure. Well, here I have a list example open, and I want to show you the basic structure of unordered and ordered lists. And those are the two most common list types that you're probably going to be using in HTML. So I'm going to scroll down through my code, and you can see in the design view that this is just a simple bulleted or unordered list. But in code view, let's take a look at the structure. Every list is surrounded by an opening and a closing list tag. In this case, the UL tag denotes an unordered list. Then the list items themselves are surrounded by an opening and a closing LI or list item tag. That's really as complex as it gets. It's very, very basic structure, very clean. Now, if I wanted to change this listing from an unordered list to an ordered list, all I would really need to do is change the opening tag to an OL tag and the closing tag to a closing OL tag. Now, if I click back over here in Design View, you can see I now have an ordered list. So very, very close in structure between ordered and unordered lists. Well, now that we've examined the structure of that, let's go ahead and create a few lists of our own in our resource page. I'm going to close this file. And then from the 0503 folder, I'm going to open up our resources.htm. Now, we've added a good bit of structure to this page already, but if I scroll down to the bottom of it, I can see that we have single paragraphs down here that need to be structured maybe a little bit better. These are all related items, and they fit very nicely within a list. So what I'm going to do is start with the first item, have you arranged for your mail/paper delivery, and I'm just going to highlight all the way down to our last item. We recommend packing a small first aid kit. So with that highlighted, I'm going to go down to my properties inspector. Again, I'm going to be making sure that I'm on the HTML tab, not the CSS tab. And I'm going to choose to go ahead and make this initially an ordered list. So very similar to any type of a word processing program that you've been using. But notice again, on the left-hand side in the code view, we're actually structuring our list. In design view, we can see we have items 1 through 21 listed in a numbered list. Now, are there things that we can change via the HTML to change how our list displays? Absolutely. If you click inside any of the list items, and I'm just going to click inside the first one here in design view, you'll notice that our properties inspector has a button on it that it didn't have before, list item. If I click on that, that's going to bring up a dialog box that allows me to change some of the properties of my list. For example, I could change the type of list that I have. In this case, I'm going to change the style. I'm going to grab the style pull-down menu, and I notice that I can choose between numbers, Roman numerals small and large, and alphabet small and large. I'm going to choose alphabet small, click OK. And now that I can see instead of starting with the number 1, it starts with an A. Also notice in code view that now our opening OL tag has an attribute. An attribute is a property inside of a tag that gives more information about that particular element. In this case, it's saying that it's an ordered list and its type should be small alphabet. Now, you can also make changes directly in the code as well. So what I'd like you to do is switch over to the code view. I'm going to remove that attribute and change the OL to a UL. So scroll all the way down, find the opening tag, and then find the closing tag. The closing tag has that little / right at the front of it. And again, I'm going to just change the O to a U. Now when I click back over in Design View, now we have bullets instead of numbers. And bullets are going to be better for this type of list because we're not really denoting any sequential information. We're just organizing grouped information. Now, occasionally, you're going to need nested lists. That is, a list appearing inside of a list. For example, if I look inside of our existing list, I have this entry here. Is your trip an outdoor adventure? If so, we recommend the following. So we have another group of information that pertains to just that item. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with comfortable hiking shoes, and I'm going to go all the way down to sunscreen because that is part of the group. So comfortable hiking shoes to sunscreen. Now, how do we nest one list inside of another? It's actually very, very simple. We're going to go right down to the Properties Inspector, and I'm just going to click this little icon here that says Indent. As soon as I do that, it goes ahead and indents that list in, and now it is a nested list. Now, how does that look in the code? Well, this is pretty interesting. Notice that the list item that this pertains to is your trip and outdoor adventure. Here's the opening LI tag, but before that list item can close, there's an entirely new unordered list inside of it. After that unordered list closes, the list item can finally close. Now, that's a very important structural point I want to make here. If you open up one tag inside of another tag, the nested tag must close first before its parent tag can close. If it were the other way around, and that UL came after the closing LI tag, that would be non-valid HTML, and in fact, you'd be basically interrupting one list and putting another one in its place. So we don't want to do that. The nice thing is Dreamweaver does all that for you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and I want to talk very briefly about definition lists. Now, definition lists aren't as widely used as unordered or ordered lists, but they are very handy in several situations. I'm going to go over to my Files panel and open up the FAQ.html file found in the 0503. So this is our site's frequently asked questions. And if I scroll down, I see that each of our frequently asked questions has a question followed by an answer. That structure is repeated over and over and over again. It'd be really nice if structurally we could tell any type of user agent that these items were related. A definition list allows us to do just that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our first question in the Backpack Cal area. What does tour difficulty in the tour description mean? I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to begin to highlight all the way down till the last answer inside Backpack California. Yes, we can take a look at our tour guide gear recommendations. Now, that can be a little tricky, so you want to double check your highlighting and make sure that you have questions and answers highlighted entirely and that you didn't get any of the lines above or lines below. Definition lists can be a little tricky, and you want to make sure that you have all of the elements selected that you need for that definition list. Okay, so now we're ready to format this. Now, if we go down to our Properties Inspector, there's nothing down here for definition lists. There's bulleted lists, there's an ordered list, but nothing for definition lists. Well, you won't find them on the Properties Inspector. You will find them, however, up in the menu. So I'm going to go up to my menu, I'm going to go to Format, List, and right there is Definition List. Now, if this is something you're going to be doing a lot, you might want to map a keyboard shortcut to that so that you don't have to keep coming up to the menu. But if you're just doing it once or twice, probably not that big of a deal to come up to the menu and select that. So as soon as I select Definition List, we see a little bit of a change here. Our answers are now indented in a little bit and give us a little bit of separation between our questions. Now, this isn't the best rendering in the world, but remember, that's what our CSS is for. We're going to style this later on with our CSS to make this look the way we want it to. I'm going to take just a moment to go over to the code because I want to examine the structure of this list and compare it to what we were doing with our unordered or ordered lists. Notice at the very top of any definition list is a DL tag. From there, it alternates between a DT tag for the term and a DD tag for the definition. So each time out, we have a DT for the term, and then we have an opening and a closing DD, which encases the definition. And that just repeats until the definition list closes out. So it's really important that you have an equal number of items, terms and definitions, and that you don't partially select a line above or partially select a line below. That can really mess up your structure. Well, to go ahead and practice this, we've got facts for each of these tour packages: California Calm, California Hot Springs, Cycle California, all the way down the page. take some time, go ahead and pause the movie, take some time, and add that additional structure to each one of those elements. As you do that, you'll get a little bit more comfortable with creating a definition list. Now, creating and editing lists inside Dreamweaver is extremely simple. It's similar to using several popular text editing programs, so a lot of what you're doing here you're going to be quite familiar with. What's really important to remember is that any changes made to the list, and all of the text in Dreamweaver for that matter, is in reality generating and modifying code, the underlying structure for all of your content. As such, you want to make sure that you understand how this code should be structured in case you ever need to go in and modify it yourself. I recommend monitoring the code as you create it, just as we're doing here, so that you're ensuring that you're formatting your code correctly. Although you can type to your heart's content in Dreamweaver, chances are that most of the copy that you work with will be created by you or another person in a program other than Dreamweaver. Getting text from those documents into Dreamweaver is a fairly straightforward process, but like most processes in Dreamweaver, there are some options that you really need to know about to make the most of your workflow. Let's examine this process in a little bit more detail. So I have our resources.htm file open. Now, you may have noticed, if we're looking over at the Files panel, that we also have an assets directory that has a resources.doc in it as well. That, of course, is a Word document. And I'm just going to switch over to Word really quickly. And this is the document that we're going to be importing into our Dreamweaver file. Now, notice that it has some built-in structure. It has some formatting. It has some bold text, some italicized text. It's got some lists down here at the bottom. So all of our text is formatted and structured really kind of the way that we want it. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and select all of my text. So either a Control or Command A. And then I'm going to copy it. Control C, Command C, depending upon what platform you're on. And now I'm going to switch back to Dreamweaver. All right, now that I'm back in Dreamweaver, I'm just going to go ahead and click at the top of the page. And I'm just going to paste. Control V, or I could go up to Edit Paste. Oh, whoa, wow. Well, that wasn't really exactly what I was hoping for. Now, notice all my text came in, so at least I'm that far ahead, but it came in as one big old block of text. I was hoping for slightly better results. So I'm going to undo that and take a closer look at my preferences. So I'm going to go up to Edit and choose Preferences. If you're on the Mac, you want to go to Dreamweaver and choose Preferences. And I want to take a look at the Copy and Paste category. Now, I've always equated this to like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Some ports too hot, some ports too cold, and you're looking for the setting for you that's going to be just right. All right, well, let's go through our options here. Currently, my preference was set to text only, and that is why I got one big, humongous block of text with no structure. I also can choose text with structure. That'd be paragraphs, lists, and tables. Those would come over. Text with structure plus basic formatting, bold and italic. And we'll check this option out. Text with structure plus full formatting, bold, italic, and styles. Now, you might think to yourself, that's going to save me a lot of time. I could go ahead and style all my text the way I want it in Word and just paste that directly into Dreamweaver, and my job is finished. Well, let's take a look at that option. If I choose text with structure plus full formatting, again, I get some options down here that come open. Retain line breaks. That would be any shift enters that you've done in Word. And clean up word paragraph spacing. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you guys use Word a lot, you know it's very common to hit enter twice to get space between paragraphs. That's kind of a no-no because you end up actually with blank paragraphs between your text. So Dreamweaver would go through and just sort of strip all those out. So those are two nice little options. I'm just going to leave them selected. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and paste my text. This time when it comes in, notice that all the structure came in. There's my lists, although something weird's going on there. I have all my headings. I've got text size coming in. Wow, this is looking great. Well, sometimes things that look great on their surface aren't so great when you dig underneath it a little bit. So I'm going to switch over to Code View, and I see something going on that I'm not too pleased about. Look at this. I have some embedded styles that came in from Word. Now, obviously, if I were working within a larger site, these styles might conflict with my other styles, but certainly they're going to add extra weight to my pages that I don't need. And then I've got some really weird stuff going on here. Span style, so I have some inline styles going on. I have a lot of formatting going on that really shouldn't be driven this way. It should be driven by my styles. A lot of these classes are Word-specific classes, so I've really cluttered up my code by doing that. So that's really not the option I wanted to do. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that as well. So now I'm going to go back to my preferences, and let's see if we can find the one that's just right for us. Well, I'm going to try this one, text with structure plus basic formatting. That'll retain all paragraphs, all headings that you've created, that sort of thing. but it's also going to keep your bold and italic text as well, but it won't bring over all those messy styles from Word that we don't really need. Again, we still retain these options down here, so I'm going to select those, and now I'm going to click OK again. So one more time, paste the text that we've copied. Now, look at this. That looks a little better, although I still have this little weird thing going on here. Sometimes you're just going to see a couple of things that you're going to need to clean up manually, and usually going into Code View will help you with that. So I can see in Code View, for some reason, Dreamweaver thinks this is 2 ULs, unordered list. So I'm just going to remove the opening and closing unordered list tag, go back into Design View, and now that looks a lot better. So again, I hope that reinforces the concept that I was talking about earlier. It's really important to know how to modify the structure of your HTML. If you're not familiar with HTML, that would have been a very difficult edit to make. Going back up through here, I can see all of my structure. When I click inside of a tag, I can see that that's a heading 3, just like I wanted. Here's a heading 1. Here's a heading 2. If I click inside my bold tag, I notice it's being bolded through the use of a strong tag, which is structurally sound. And my italicized text is being italicized through an M tag, which again is structurally sound HTML. So the integration between Word and Dreamweaver is pretty good. If you use some of the basic styling in Word and choose heading 1, heading 2, Dreamweaver is going to retain that and actually map that to tags. If you italicize text in Word, you bring it over, Dreamweaver is going to convert that to an M tag, or bold text is going to convert it to a strong tag. So there's pretty tight integration between it. Now, copying and pasting your text into Dreamweaver is likely to work fine for most of the stuff you need to do, but there is another way to bring text in to Dreamweaver from Word, and we're going to take a closer look at that in our next movie. In an effort to create efficient workflows, Adobe has integrated Dreamweaver with many other programs that you or your team members are likely to use. Most integration is understandably within the Creative Suite, but other programs like Word feature differing levels of integration as well. Now, it's not often that I have to break bad news to the Mac folks, but this is sadly one of those times. The integration between Word and Dreamweaver that I'm about to show you only works on the PC version of Dreamweaver. Still, you Mac folks should keep watching. Don't turn this off, because there is one option in the following example that does work for you, and it's something you might want to take advantage of later on. Okay, so I want to bring in my Word file. So I'm going to go up to File and choose Import. And I noticed that I have options for importing Word and Excel documents. So if you're importing tables, that's a nice way to do that as well. Now again, on the Mac, you guys are just going to see the first two options. You won't see Word and Excel. So I'm going to choose Import Word, and I'm going to browse into the 0505 Assets folder, and there is our resources.doc. Now, before I click Open, I'm going to check out some of the formatting options I have down below. If you watched the previous movie, these formatting options are going to be very familiar to you. Text only, text with structure plus basic formatting, such as bold and italic text, or you can bring in those Word-specific styles. I'm going to choose the third option, text structure basic formatting, and I definitely want it to clean up Word's paragraph spacing, so if there are extra paragraph breaks in there, I want those cleaned up. I'm going to go ahead and click Open, and in comes our text with structure intact. Again, notice that our heading 1 is here, heading 2, heading 3s, our strong tags, our M tags. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see that our tour checklist is there, so everything is there that we're expecting. Now, I'm going to undo that, because as easy as that is, there's actually even an easier way to do this. With any document, blank or one that already has some content in it, I can go over to my Files panel. I can open up this asset directory, and there's my resources.doc just sitting in there. And I can literally select the file and simply drag it to the location on the page that I want it to paste that text. That is insanely easy. Now, when I do that, I get the dialog box that comes up with a couple of choices. Again, I'm going to go with the text with structure plus basic formatting, but I notice there's one option here that we didn't have before. So here we have an option to create a link. Now, what does that do? Well, if I select that and click OK, notice that Dreamweaver creates a link to that file. So here's some text called resources. And if I click on that, I can see in the link dialog box, it's actually linking to that doc. So if you wanted to give your users an option of clicking and downloading that file, that's a really quick and easy way to do that. For you guys on the Mac, that is exactly what option you're going to have. You won't have all the other integration options, but you will have that. So whether you're wanting to create a link or whether you're wanting to bring in the entire file, that's up to you. And you have all those formatting options as well so you bring in the text exactly the way that you want to bring in that text. So there you go. What's easier than dragging and dropping? Now, again, I'm sorry to say that this feature doesn't work on a Mac, but do take note of the fact that if you want to link to an external Word file for users of your site to download it, it's as easy as dragging and dropping as well. CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheets, and the name is actually a pretty good description of how they work. A CSS style is merely a collection of formatting attributes that is then used to style an element on the page. A style sheet is a collection of these styles that can either apply to a single page in your site, a range of pages, or your entire site. Understanding some simple rules about CSS will help you write more efficient styles and help you create more manageable websites. If you've ever used styles in a program like Word or InDesign, you already have a pretty good idea as to how styles work. Say, for example, that you want all of your headlines to look the same way. You wouldn't want to format each one individually. It's faster and more efficient to simply write a single style that controls all of your headings. Later, modifying that style will then update all of your headings, making your document even more efficient to manage. CSS works this way, but does it on a site-wide basis. So you can literally control the look and feel of your entire site with one file. By placing your CSS in an external file and linking it to all the pages in your site, you can control any updates to your site's formatting through that single file. CSS doesn't have to be placed in an external file, however. When you are creating your CSS, you have several options about where the styles should be placed. You can place styles in external files and then link them to pages. You can embed the styles within an individual web page. Or you can create inline styles that are actually part of a single element in your code. Now, for the most part, inline styles are discouraged, but are occasionally very useful for items that will be used in basic user agents such as HTML emails. Deciding where to place your styles has a lot to do with how you wish to take advantage of the cascade itself. As a general rule, inline styles will overwrite embedded styles, which will in turn overwrite external styles. That makes it possible to have global styles in external documents and then use the cascade to overwrite some of those styles locally in specific pages. Now that we have a basic understanding of how styles work, we'll examine a style rule in detail in our next movie so that we can understand the structure and syntax of a CSS rule. Styles in CSS are made up of two parts, the selector and the declaration. The selector comes first and describes the element on the page that is to be controlled through this rule. Here we see what is known as an element selector, and it will be controlling all heading 1s in our current document. Next, we have the declaration. The declaration is contained within these curly braces, which essentially tell the browser that all properties contained within should be applied to the element identified by the selector. Inside the declaration, we have properties and values. Notice that they're separated by a colon and then ended with a semicolon. This tells the browser to move on to the next property if there are any available. In this case, our rule would take all heading 1s on the page, make them Arial, 1.4 ems in size, and red. Now, if you're brand new to CSS, the syntax can look a little intimidating, but by breaking down the syntax into its individual parts, it's easy to see how simple a CSS rule actually is. The nice thing about creating CSS within Dreamweaver is the various options that you have when generating styles. If you are the type that really likes to hand code, Dreamweaver gives you a lot of support, including code hinting for CSS that really speeds up the coding process. If, on the other hand, you don't like to hand code or have never done it, Dreamweaver does a great job of creating the CSS for you so that you don't really need to worry about the syntax. Just like any other automated process, it's a really good idea to know how to manually tweak your styles just in case you need to make minor adjustments here and there. So my advice is that even if you use Dreamweaver to generate your styles for you, be sure that you understand the rules and syntax of CSS just in case you have to go under the hood and work on the code yourself. As you begin to work with more and more sites, you'll find that you have a specific way that you want your styles to be presented and formatted. If you're like me, those preferences might change over time as you get more comfortable with doing things by hand. Fortunately, Dreamweaver has multiple preferences that allow customization of exactly how your styles are created, presented, and formatted. Let's take a moment to go over these preferences and customize how Dreamweaver goes about creating your CSS. So I have the main.css file open, And if I just scroll down, I can see that there are a lot of styles in this document, hundreds and hundreds of lines of them actually, and these are the styles that are driving our Explore California site. Now, before we get into creating these styles, I think it's useful to take a look at some of the preferences that govern how these styles are displayed in our code view. So I'm going to go up to my preferences. Again, you can go to Edit Preferences on the PC, Dreamweaver Preferences on the Mac. And the first preference I want to go to is Code Coloring. Now, some people complain about the magenta and they think it's a little hard to see. Well, you can change that if you'd like. So if I go to Code Coloring, I can select the CSS document type and click on the Edit Coloring Scheme. We have a little preview down here that shows you any changes that you make and what they're going to look like within your structure. But you could come right down here and choose CSS Selector, for example, and you could change the color of that. So maybe you might want to make them red, for example. Now, just be consistent with that, because if you're using red for a selector and a friend of yours is using green for a selector, it's going to be really different. Also, recognize that some colors are pretty common. For example, green is typically used to denote literal strings like you see here. So changing that into something else might actually throw somebody that's used to singing in green. So just be sure that what you change is going to be consistent for you and any team that you're on. I'm going to switch that back to magenta. I actually don't mind it, to be honest with you. Now there's another setting that you can change as well. If I go into the code format preference, and for the advanced formatting, choose CSS, I can choose exactly how my CSS is formatted. Right now, each property is on a separate line. That makes it extremely easy to read, and as you're writing your CSS code for the first time, I really recommend that. However, it also takes up more lines of code. So if you turn that off later on, you could shorten the lines of code that your CSS is taking up, and that might actually make it a little bit easier to deploy. So that's usually something I change once I'm ready to go ahead and make this code live online. I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. Now, there are a couple of other preferences that you can change, but I want to show you why you might want to change those preferences. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK, and I'm going to write a rule for you that shows off what I was talking about. And oh, they changed red anyway. That's okay. Again, it's so easy to change that preference. I can go change it in just a little bit. Okay, so just anywhere on here, I'm going to create a rule for my heading ones. Now, if I open up my curly brace and hit return to go down to the next line, I'm just going to do some margins here. So I'm going to do a margin dash top. So that's going to add a top margin to my headings of 10 pixels. Then I'm going to add a margin to the right of 10 pixels. Then I'm going to add a margin to the bottom of 10 pixels. And then I'm going to add a margin to the left of 10 pixels. Now, don't worry about doing this with me. I'm just trying to show you one of the things that Dreamweaver can do to speed up the creation of your CSS and make your CSS a little bit more efficient. But what I've done here is I've created a rule for heading ones that contain both a top, right, bottom, and left margin. And you can see they're all 10 pixels. Well, that's 4 lines of code. That's adding a good bit of weight. I could have actually written the exact same rule this way. I could have just typed in margin 10 pixels. Much shorter, right? Well, this is what we call shorthand notation. And if you're having Dreamweaver generate your code for you, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and tell Dreamweaver that you'd like to use this shorthand notation so that your code becomes as efficient as possible. Let me show you where to set that. If you go to Edit, Preferences, or again, Dreamweaver Preferences on the Mac, you can now go down to the category CSS Styles. You'll notice that we have some checkboxes here for creating shorthand notation. Background properties, margins like I was just working on, and padding, borders, border widths, list styles, fonts, all of those have an ability to create shorthand notation. Well, I'm going to go ahead and check everybody except for fonts. Now, why is that? Well, if you do a font shorthand notation, and if you're brand new to CSS, this might not really make a whole lot of sense right now, but trust me, as you learn more about CSS, this will make a whole lot of sense. But if you do font shorthand notation, you have to set properties for font weight, font size, font style, font family, and you have to do it in the proper order, font variant, all that stuff. The main problem with that is that if you don't state one of those, let's say you left out font weight or you left out font variant, what would happen is the default would be used for that, and it might actually overwrite one of your other styles. So I typically don't use font shorthand notation unless I'm really sure of where I want to use it. So I typically turn that off and do font shorthand notation by hand. So I've got those 4 items checked. Notice that we can also tell Dreamweaver exactly when to do that. Notice that we can say, hey, only change it if the original used shorthand, or change it based on all these settings that we have above. So we're going to do that. And then finally, we have an option of what to do if we double-click the CSS file in the CSS panel. Now, if we edit a rule, for example, let's say I was to double-click on an H1 rule in the CSS panel, it would open up the CSS dialog box that we're going to be seeing in just a moment. Or I have the opportunity of editing it within the Properties pane. I'll show you that option in just a moment. Or the opportunity to jump into Code View. This is all about personal preference. If you're brand new to CSS, I recommend leaving this as Edit using CSS Dialog. That dialog box is typically a little bit easier for people who are new to CSS to use because it just presents you with certain options and you don't have to worry about any of the syntax. So with those options set, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now I know that my CSS is set up to the preferences that I want from my particular workflow. Now, not everybody likes to work with CSS the same way. And I think it's great that Adobe makes it so easy for us to get Dreamweaver's workflow to match our own personal preferences. I would advise you to monitor how you work with Dreamweaver over time so that you can make sure that Dreamweaver's workflow reflects the way that you like to work. The CSS Styles panel acts as the central hub for all things CSS in Dreamweaver, providing you with both a global view of all document styles, as well as allowing you to focus on individual rules and style applications. So for this exercise, I have our resources.html file open in the 0604 folder. Now, you're going to find the CSS Styles panel in the CSS panel grouping. And that's usually located at the top of the panel dock, although you can reposition it in custom workspaces if you'd like. Now, I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here by double-clicking on the Files panel tab. That'll collapse that, and that'll give us a full dock to work here with the CSS Styles panel, because depending upon the view you're looking at it with, it can take up a lot of room. Now, at the very top of the panel, you'll find buttons for two views, All and Current. The All view gives you an overview of all of the CSS styles applied to the current document, while the Current view gives you a detailed view of the rules applied to a selected element. Before we start creating our styles in earnest, let's take a moment to get a little bit more comfortable with finding our way around and using the CSS Styles panel. Now, if I click on All and I scroll all the way up to the top of my rules listing, I can see that I have an external style sheet linked to this file. How do I know it's an external style sheet? Because it says main.css, I can see the extension. I can collapse all these rules, and if you had multiple style sheets or embedded styles, you would see all of those guys listed as well. But for this particular file, we just have the one external style sheet linked. Now, we do have some parentheses right out beside it that says screen, projection. Those are referring to the media type for the style sheet. And if I switch over to the code view of the page, you can see right here in this link file, we have an attribute that says media equals screen, projection. That means that these styles are being applied to any devices that request the screen or projection media type. So these styles wouldn't apply to screen readers or other user agents like that. I'm going to switch back to design view, and let's take a look at specific rules. I'm going to click right here in this single rule, Got Questions. Now, I can see by looking at the structure of my page and my tag selector that this is inside of a heading 1, which is inside of a div with the ID of main article, which is inside of a div with an ID of main content. So I can look for some specific rules that are controlling that element. However, it's a lot easier to find if I click inside that and switch over to current mode. Current mode tells me exactly the rule that I'm targeting. And I'm just going to expand this out a little bit so you guys can see this a little bit better, because sometimes that's a little hard to see. And I may need to rearrange these panels a little bit. So notice that you can take the CSS Styles panel and you can begin to move these dividers to give yourself a little bit more room. Let's examine the current rule in a little bit more detail. The top pane gives us a summary for the current selection. And here we see all of the properties that are styling our currently selected content. Now, not all of these properties necessarily come from the same rule. That's one of the things about CSS. You'll notice that if you hover over one of those properties, it'll tell you exactly which rule they're coming from. Notice that they're not all coming from the same rule. Now, if we look down below that, we can see all of the rules that are affecting this element. And I can scroll back and forth to see which rules are affecting it the most. The ones at the bottom are the most specific styles, and any content set here would overwrite content set in the styles above it. Finally, down below that, if I select any of these individual rules, I get the properties for those specific rules. And if I want, I could even add additional properties to this. So let's say that I wanted a little bit of extra spacing down below this headline. I could select the rule that I want to affect it, in this case, pound main content, main article H1, and I could just click right here to add a property. Now you can grab that pull-down list if you're not as familiar with property names, or if you know what you're wanting to do, you could just type it in. In this case, I'm going to choose margin-bottom. Just going to add a little bit of space underneath this, so I'm going to type in 0.4 ems, and that's EM, so I can just type in 0.4 EM and hit return, and that's going to increase the spacing. You can see the text here went down by just a little bit. So anytime you want, you can use the CSS Styles panel to add to an existing rule without having to go into any code or open up any additional dialog boxes. Now I'm going to switch back to all for just a moment and talk about what types of things we can display in the all view. First off, we get all of our rules that are in our external style sheet. So a lot of times here, you have to scroll down until you find the rule that you're looking for. So if I scroll down, I can find right here, pound main content, pound main article H1. That's the rule that we just changed. If I click on that, I can see that now I have the same summary of the properties in that rule, and I have the ability to add properties here as well. Well, you can change how this panel displays these rules. If you notice in the CSS Styles panel, there are 3 icons in the lower left-hand corner of the all view. The first icon gives us what is known as a category view. It's going to be a listing of all the categories, such as fonts, backgrounds, block level changes, borders, box model. So if you're familiar with these categories, you can quickly access them and change properties directly through this category listing. We also have a listing that shows a list view of every single CSS property that you can change, and there are a lot of them. So if you like that view, you get a nice alphabetical list of those. Any properties that are being used and set on the rule will appear at the very top of the listing, and they're highlighted and colored in blue. Finally, we have my favorite view. The favorite view shows only the properties that you have set, and it reduces the amount of clutter that you have to look at. That's my preferred view, and that's typically what I'll do. Now, the CSS Styles panel can be used for a lot more too. Let's say we want to create a different rule. In this case, maybe we want to create a rule that's going to control this heading 2. It's going to be very similar to what we had before, so I'm just going to scroll down and click inside that heading 2. I'm going to go down to my CSS Styles panel, and in the lower right-hand corner, there's another set of icons. The one that has the page with the plus symbol on it, if you hover over that, it'll tell you that's a new CSS rule. I'm going to click on that. Now we're going to cover this dialog box in a little bit more detail later on. Suffice to say that this dialog box is going to assist you in creating your rules. In this case, notice that it automatically came up with what we call a compound selector because it knows that there are a lot of factors identifying that element on the page. So we're seeing here wrapper, main content, main article, H2. Well, I'm going to get a little less specific with it because if you remember our previous rule that had the H1 had the main content and the main article, but it didn't have wrapper, so that's not really necessary. So I'm going to choose less specific, and now it resolves itself to say pound main content, pound main article, H2. Perfect. I can also tell Dreamweaver where to place these styles. In this case, I'm going to place it in main.css, which is that external style sheet. Your other choice is to place it in this document only, which would embed it in the head of the file, or you can create a brand new style sheet to place that in as well. I'm going to leave that as main.css and click OK. Now, this is a great dialog box. What we get now is the CSS rule definition dialog box. This is a dialog box that's separated by categories, typography, background, block properties, box model properties, that you can go through and set each one of those properties for this specific rule. So again, if you're not that familiar with CSS, this is a great dialog box to access because it gives you an ability to go ahead and choose all these items for your particular element. In this case, font size, I'm going to click in font size and say 1.6 EM. You can just type in EM, or you can grab M's from the pull-down menu right there. So 1.6 EM. For color, I'm going to type in pound 51341A. If you hit tab, you can see that that's going to be that brown color that we're using throughout our site. Now, CSS can either use RGB values or hexadecimal notation for color values. Most people use hexadecimal values, although with the advent of CSS3 and HTML5, RGB values are starting to be used in an increasing amount. Font weight, I'm going to grab that pull-down menu and choose normal. Most headings are bold by default, but I want this heading to not be bold, so I'm going to change font weight to normal. I'm also going to go down and set a couple of other properties in my box category. The box category is where you choose things like padding and margin, so it's primarily used for spacing. For margin, I'm going to deselect same for all. And for top margin, I'm going to type in 1.2 EM. For bottom margin, I'm just going to type in 1 EM. Now, if you're curious about what an M is, we'll have a movie a little bit later on that describes unit of measurements. But an M is a unit of measurement typically used in relation to type. Finally, we're going to do one more thing that might be a little confusing for those of you who are new to CSS. We're going to grab this clear property and we're going to choose both. What that will do is it tells Dreamweaver, don't allow objects to float to my left or float to my right. It's basically going to make sure that this heading is on its own line and not affected by any floats that we may have placed into our file. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I can see right there my heading changes. Now, you'll notice that it placed that rule right underneath the H1 tag. How did it know to do that? Well, it wasn't guessing. It was the fact that I actually had the H1 rule selected in my styles before I created it. So if you want to control the placement of where your rules go, make sure you highlight the rule just above where you want it to be. Although you can certainly select rules and drag them up and down the order to organize them if you would like. Now, I know it seems like we've covered a lot of ground, but to be honest, we've just scratched the surface of what we can do with this CSS Styles panel. Don't worry, you'll be using the CSS Styles panel throughout the rest of this title. That's going to give you plenty of time to familiarize yourself with those capabilities, as well as exploring some of its additional functionality a little bit later on. While the CSS Styles panel is where you're going to be doing the majority of the work on your CSS, the Properties Inspector allows you to do a fair amount of CSS-based work directly through it, without having to go to the Styles panel. It is important to note, however, that without understanding what the Properties Inspector is doing in regards to CSS, you can cause some major issues within your site. So let's take a moment to examine how the Properties Inspector works with your site's CSS. So I have the index.html file open here in the 0605 folder. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit so that I can focus on this first paragraph, explore our world your way, and we're going to explore kind of how the Properties Inspector allows us to interact and change the CSS of this paragraph. So I'm just going to click to focus inside that paragraph, kind of anywhere inside of it. Now, in the Properties Inspector, I need to focus on my CSS properties. So I'm going to click the CSS tab and make sure that's highlighted and not the HTML tag. It's pretty easy to tell because we get some formatting attributes here in place of the other items that we were seeing in HTML. Now, we're presented with some formatting options, but they're fairly limited. Notice that we get font, size, and color. We also have bold and italic, but remember, those two are going to trigger the creation of a brand new style. We also have text alignment, so align left, center, right, justified. Those are some of the things that we can change here in the Properties Inspector. Now, I want to show you something that's really, really important. And when most people first start using the Properties Inspector to change their formatting, they don't really pay attention to this, and it's a big deal. Notice that as soon as I clicked inside this paragraph, right over here in this pull-down menu, targeted rule changed. If I click inside the heading, for example, notice that it's targeting pound main content H1. If I click inside the paragraph, it's targeting the pound main content P. Now, what is that? Well, that's a CSS rule that has already been created. That means that that rule is in existence right now in our external style sheet. If you were to browse through your CSS styles, you would eventually find that. There's the rule pound main content P. So how did it know which rule to target? Well, it picks the closest rule to that element. So the most specific rule that's affecting that element is going to show up within your targeted rule. Sometimes that's a really specific rule like the one we see here. Sometimes it's a really generic rule such as a paragraph. Now, what that means is that any change that you make to these formatting properties over here will affect that rule. Now, that's not always going to be what you want. So you do have the ability to grab this pull-down menu and choose any rule. You'll find classes down here. Those would allow you to actually apply the class to the paragraph, by the way, not change it. But if you go up from that, you can see all of the rules that are affecting this paragraph. There's pound main content P. Well, I could shift that so that it was affecting just that generic targeted P rule as well. So it's up to you to either use the default one that comes up or to choose your own. Now, there's another thing that's really important here as well. A lot of people assume that based on the targeted rule they're seeing here, that these properties come from that specific rule. And that's not true. Notice if I hover over the font, I get a little tooltip that comes up that says, hey, the property font family is inherited from the rule body. Size, if I hover over that, says that's coming from pound main content P, and that's our targeted rule. Finally, if I hover over color, notice that that says, hey, that's coming from the rule P. So those three values are coming from three different selectors. So if you were to change one of those properties, it's not going to be guaranteed to be changed in the targeted rule. It's going to be changed in whichever rule it's found in. So in this case, If I change color, it's going to go back and change that within the paragraph rule. It's not going to add that to the pound main content P. Let's see that in action. So if I go here and click on this color chip, I can choose any color I want. I can even type in a color, but there's something really cool you can do here in Dreamweaver. Check this out. Let's say I wanted to use one of the colors in my interface. I could click on the color chip, move my mouse, and I could move it over any area of the interface, even photographs. So let's say I wanted to pick up the purple color from her shirt. I could go ahead and choose that, and now my paragraphs are that purple color. Well, notice again that if I hover over that color chip, it tells me that the property color is being inherited from the rule P. So instead of just changing all my main content paragraphs, let me scroll and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I changed the color of all my paragraphs. So all my paragraphs have that purple color to it. So using the Properties Inspector to speed up your CSS workflow does make a lot of sense, but as you can see, you really need to be aware of how the changes you are making might be affecting styles elsewhere in your site. As your command over CSS grows and you get more comfortable structuring the styles within your site, you'll find the Properties Inspector an indispensable part of your day-to-day workflow. Initially, however, I really want to caution you to be careful when using it so that you don't make unintended changes either throughout your site or perhaps in targeting the wrong selector. The creation and modification of CSS is central to almost everything you do when designing web pages. We see this focus reflected in the number of panels and tools that Dreamweaver provides us to work with our CSS. Of those tools, I count the Code Navigator as one of the most important. The Code Navigator gives you an easy way to access and modify your styles from anywhere in your document, without having to know exactly which rule is controlling the element from within your styles. As your site gets more complicated, it's not unusual to have styles in various places throughout your site, all coming together at runtime to determine final rendering. Because of this, it can often be difficult to know exactly which rule to modify to achieve the desired results. Let's take a moment and explore the Code Navigator and how it can help you quickly assess and access your styles. So here I have the tours.html open. If I scroll down through the page, I can see something is a little amiss. So here we have our tour description text, and the font size is a little large, and the line spacing is a little large as well. I would like this text to be a little smaller so that it would fit a little bit more neatly right beside each of the graphics there. So right now we're having some text sort of flow down there and break, and it's a little too big. So I want to change that up a little bit. Now, if you look over in our CSS Styles panel, you can see how many selectors we have driving this page. There's a tremendous amount of selectors. So it would probably take us a fair amount of time to comb through all those selectors to figure out exactly which one is driving this text. Now, knowing the structure of what you're working with really helps. If I click inside this text, I notice that it's inside of a div with the class tour description. So that is probably a nice indicator of exactly what's controlling this. Now, this is where the Code Navigator can really help us. If you click inside of an element, if you just wait for a second or two, you're going to see this little icon come up. It looks kind of like the steering wheel of a ship. Well, if you hover over that icon, it'll tell you that this is the Code Navigator. Clicking on that, it's going to open up another window, sort of like a tooltip. You're going to see this listing of all the styles that are affecting this element. So what we're looking at right now is a list of all of the selectors in our CSS that is in some way or another styling that particular element. This means that every time you click on an element, you're going to see a totally different list based off of that element and the styles driving it. These styles are arranged in the order of furthest from the element to the closest of the element. Now, what that means is that any property at the bottom of the list that conflicts with a property above it, bottom property wins. So if you're wondering, what size is this, what line height, you can just start at the bottom, hover over the rule, you'll see a summary of that rule's properties, and you can just go sort of all the way up to determine exactly which rules are controlling which properties. So in this case, we have this main content tour description P, very descriptive, very specific rule, and all it's doing is setting font size to 1em. The rule just above that, pound main content space P, is giving us both font size and line height, and then finally the rule just above that is giving us our color. So you might think to yourself, well, I probably should modify this one for line height and this one for size, and if I wanted to change color, maybe refine that one. But here's the problem with that. Pound main content space P is going to be controlling all paragraphs found within the main content. We need to be a little bit more specific because remember, we only want to change this text. So really the rule that we're going to be changing is the targeted rule at the very bottom of the list. Now, before we get into how to use the Code Navigator to make changes to your CSS, I want to talk a little bit more about the Code Navigator's functionality. You'll notice that every time you click on an element, that icon comes up. Well, if you're not in the mood to work with the Code Navigator, or that's not the task at hand, that can be more than a little annoying. So I know a lot of people out there that don't like the Code Navigator just because it seems to always get in the way. Well, notice in the lower right-hand corner of this dialog box, we have a little check mark that says Disable. I'm going to go ahead and check that. Now, that also might bring up the question, well, if you disable it, then how in the world do you use it? Well, just to the left of that, you'll see a keyboard shortcut indicating how to bring up the Code Navigator. On the PC, you'll Alt-click an item, and on the Mac, you'll Option-Command-click an item. So now with that disabled, let me click off of my element again, and now no matter where I click or how long I pause, Code Navigator icon doesn't come up anymore. So if we're not actually trying to use it, it's not going to get in the way. I like that. But now to bring it up, all I have to do is hold down my Alt key and click on the element. Remember, if you're on a Mac, you're going to hold down your Command and your Option key while you click. That brings up the exact same dialog box, and now you control when the Code Navigator appears. And for me, that's a lot more efficient. Okay, well, let's see how we can actually change this selector so that the text is doing what we want it to do. I'm going to go all the way down and find that last rule, #main content .tour description space P. I'll hover over that, and I'm just going to click it. You'll notice as soon as you hover over it that it becomes a link. I'm just going to go ahead and click that. Now, that's going to take me to this rule in two separate locations. On the left-hand side, it takes me directly into my CSS code. So if you prefer hand coding, it's going to jump you right to your CSS code. It's going to jump to that specific spot, and you can just begin adding properties or modifying the ones that you already have there. If hand coding is not your cup of tea, you'll notice on the right-hand side that if I look at my CSS styles panel, that rule is highlighted right there. So it's very easy for me to go ahead and select that. So that's a pretty nice way of just sort of jumping to that particular rule in the CSS styles panel without having to browse all the way through it. Now, to give myself a little bit more room here, I'm going to go ahead and close my files panel. I can do that by double-clicking the tab here. And now I can go in and modify the properties for this particular rule. Now remember, I wanted to do two things here. Make the text a little smaller. So I'm going to change the font size from 1em to 0.9ems. The next thing I wanted to do is adjust the line height so that the lines were a little closer together. So I'm going to click here to add a property. Now I can either type in the line height property, or I can grab the pull-down menu, scroll through the list, and find line height. So if you're not exactly sure how that's written out, feel free to use that list. Next, I'm going to type in 1.5 for my line height. That's a little shorter than 1.8, which is what it was before. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure we're doing a multiple there rather than a unit of measurement. We'll talk about line height in the chapter on typography, so we're going to go into that in more detail a little bit later on. I'm going to go ahead and hit return or enter to make sure I make that change. And if I switch over to design view, now we can see that our text is a lot closer together and it fits within that space nicely. I'm going to go ahead and do a save all so that my CSS is saved as well. And there we go. We've used the Code Navigator to target a specific element on the page and modify its styles in order to achieve the styling that we were looking for. So as you can see, when working with really complex sites, the Code Navigator can greatly speed up the process of identifying where a property is being set, which properties from other rules are being applied, and then targeting and modifying the proper rule for the desired change. Sometimes, some of the best changes to a program are their small incremental updates that just make existing features work better. A prime example of this in CS5 is the addition of CSS Enable to Dreamweaver's CSS workflow. CSS Enable allows you to enable and disable specific properties of a CSS rule. This allows you to quickly troubleshoot rules, assess the effectiveness of a specific property, and experiment with design. Let's take a quick look at CSS Enable and the different ways we can utilize it in Dreamweaver. So here we have the tour detail big sur.html file open. Now, I'm going to scroll down just a tad bit, and I'm focusing on this little area right here, the name of the tour and then the price and the days. Not crazy about that styling. I don't really like what we have going on there. But before we get into working with the CSS of this, I want to take a closer look at the actual source code of this so that we understand the structure that we're styling. I'm going to go to split screen view and look at the source code, and I may need to move this over a little bit more so it's less confusing. And what we're looking at is we're looking at a heading 2. So both of these lines are a single heading, heading 2, Big Sur Retreat, and then 3 days, $350. You'll notice that the 3 days, $350 is in a span tag, and that span tag's class is tour cost. So we're going to have two selectors that we're dealing with here. One's going to target the H2 within the main article, and the other one is going to target the span tag inside that H2. So we're going to need to modify both of those in order to get the styling that we're looking for, or at least the span tag anyway, because it's the one that to me doesn't look all that great. So if I go ahead and click inside this headline, Big Sur Retreat, I can go over to my CSS Styles panel and click on Current. Remember, that's going to show me the current targeted style. I'm going to go down to my Files panel, double-click the tab so I get a little bit more room for my CSS Styles panel, and I see something that's a little different from previous versions of Dreamweaver. Notice that there's a property called Margin Bottom, and Margin Bottom has this little no symbol out beside it here and here. Well, that is CSS Enable. So prior to working on this file, Margin Bottom has been disabled, and it displays with that little circle with the line through it. Well, let's say that I actually do want that margin on the bottom. Enabling it is extremely easy. I can just come right beside that wherever I find that and click on it, and it's going to turn that property right back on. So you can use CSS Enable Disable in a number of different locations. For example, you can come up here to the summary, and in the summary you can enable and disable properties. You can highlight one of the properties down here in the bottom summary, and you can use the Disable Enable CSS Property icon, which is right down here at the bottom of your CSS Styles panel. Or you can go right beside the property itself here and enable and disable it here as well. As we'll see in just a moment, that works in the All view of the CSS Styles panel as well. All right, so I'm going to leave that turned on, so I've got to remember to enable that. And now I'm going to go down to this 3 days, $350. So I'm just going to click right there in that little subsection. And I see another listing of properties, and again, I see one that's already been disabled. Okay, well, let's change a couple of things here. First off, I'm going to change color. So I'm going to find the color property, and I'm going to change it from £FFF to £333, which is a gray. Now it really looks bad, but I'm going to play around with disabling some of these other properties. I'm going to go ahead and disable the background color, and then I'm going to go ahead and disable padding, and then I'm going to go ahead and disable width. So now that looks a little bit more reasonable. In fact, I want to see what the bottom border is going to look like on this, so I'm going to turn that on. And in order to kind of preview how this is really going to look, I'm going to turn Live View on. I can go right up to my document toolbar right here, click on Live View to turn that on, and I like that formatting a lot better than what we had before. So one of the things that you can do with CSS Enable is kind of play around with various properties, find the ones that give you the styling you're looking for, and just kind of go with those. Now, there are other things that you need to be aware of with CSS Enable. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my CSS file and look at the code of that. One of the easiest ways to do that is to bring up the Code Navigator. So once again, I'm just going to Alt-click my text. If you're on the Mac, you're going to be Command-clicking that. And I'm going to go right down here to the bottom selector, click on that. Check this out. When you're in the Code Navigator and you hover over a property, if it has disabled properties, it'll show you that here as well. So CSS Enable Disable displays almost anywhere that you'll see your CSS code. Well, I'm going to click on that to jump to that particular item. And now if I look at this rule in particular, I will see that these properties have been disabled with a comment. It's a very special type of comment because you'll notice it has this bracket notation disabled. Now, you do not want to modify that in code view because if you turn the comment off, it's going to leave that bracket behind and this property will not be re-enabled. So make sure any enabling or disabling using CSS Enable is done within the CSS Styles panel. I'm going to switch back to Design View really quickly. And as I mentioned before, all of those properties that we disabled, we really don't want them anymore. So I'm going to switch over to my All view just to kind of preview how that looks. And if I scroll down, I can find this selector. There it is. Pound main content, pound main article, H2, span, tour cost. And now I see that all of those disabled properties are listed. Well, this is a nice little feature. I can right-click that selector, and I have the choice of enabling all disabled properties. So if you just wanted to turn them all back on, you could do that. And you also have this really cool option. So if you play around with it for a little while, and you decide, you know what, the ones that I've disabled, I really don't need them anymore, you can choose Delete All Disabled and Selected Rule. As soon as I do that, it's literally going to go into your CSS and just delete all those. So all those commented areas are ripped out of that particular property, leaving me with the styling that I was really looking for, which is really, really cool. So CSS Enable can speed up the process of troubleshooting rules, experimenting with different styling, or the process of modifying any CSS rule. While it is a great way to quickly try out various rule combinations or check to see if a specific property is causing trouble, remember that leaving a CSS rule disabled does leave a proprietary comment in your CSS file. This may confuse some team members or add unwanted weight to your code, so make sure you get rid of any disabled properties when you're done working on a particular rule. Now that we have a better understanding of how Dreamweaver works with and creates CSS, it's time to focus on learning the CSS itself. Now, we won't be able to cover every detail of CSS. It's a really, really big subject, but we're going to cover the basics so that this foundation can carry you for the remainder of the title. I recommend checking out the other CSS titles on the lynda.com online training library for a more thorough exploration of CSS. Now, the most basic and fundamental selector in CSS is the element selector. Put simply, the element selector allows us to restyle an element based on its tag. To restyle our paragraphs, for example, we simply use the P selector. Now, there are pros and cons to using element selectors. One of the things that make them so powerful is that by using them, we're affecting all of those elements, not just specific ones. That means that restyling the P tag changes all paragraphs site-wide. This can save a tremendous amount of time, but rarely do we need all paragraphs to look exactly the same. Thankfully, to deal with that, we have additional selector types that can help us out. Before we move on to those, let's practice creating a few element selectors. So I've opened up the element selectors.html file, and we have a couple of elements on the page that we want to style. We have a heading 1 tag, we have some paragraphs, and we have another heading 1 tag a little further down the page. Well, one of the things that I want to explore in addition to creating paragraph tags is the concept of inheritance. And it's certainly easier to understand once you see it, so let's just go ahead and write our first element selector. I'm going to go over to my CSS styles panel, and the little page icon down here in the lower right-hand corner of it with the plus symbol is new CSS rule. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Now, the new CSS rule dialog box allows us to write styles based on which selector type we're looking for. Notice, for example, at the very top we have a pull-down menu that allows us to create class selectors, ID selectors, tag, and compound selectors. Well, element selectors are often referred to as tag selectors, so that's the one I want to choose for what we're doing here. So I'm just going to choose tag selector. Now, you may have noticed something different come up in this little pull-down menu below that. I had heading 1 come up. You may see a paragraph or some other element. Whatever you're currently selected on or whatever you're focused on in Dreamweaver, that element is going to show up. Actually, I'm going to style a tag that's much higher up in the page order. I'm going to style the body tag. Now, I can either type that in, or I can grab it from the pull-down menu. You can go through a list of all your available tags and choose it that way. Now, the body tag is the parent tag around all visual elements. So by writing a style for the body tag, we're going to use the concept of inheritance. Inheritance says that any property placed on a parent tag is inherited by its child tags. Now, what that means is if we applied a color, for example, to body tag or font size or a font family, then everything inside of it would be that family, that size, and that color. Now, that sounds great, but it can be a little tricky because not all properties are going to inherit, and they're not all going to inherit exactly the same way. So it takes a little getting used to before you feel like you're fully in control of inheritance. Now, I can define this rule in an external style sheet, or I can embed them in this document. For this particular lesson, we're going to do it in this document only. That will embed the styles on this page, meaning they will only apply to this document. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And from the CSS rule definition dialog box that comes up, the first option I'm going to change here is some typography options. So I'm going to stay right within this category. And for font family, I'm going to grab the pull-down menu there, and I'm going to choose Georgia, Times New Roman, Times, and Serif. Now, you might be wondering why we've chosen 5 fonts there. This is something called a font stack. And in the chapter on controlling typography with CSS, I'll talk about font stacks in more detail. For font size, I'm going to choose 100%. Now, again, I typed that in 100%, but you can also use this unit of measurement pull-down menu beside it to choose from all these available units of measurements, pixels, points, ems. We typically use percentage for the body tag because what that will do is it sets the entire page's font size relative to the user agent. So if a browser has its default font size set to 16 pixels that's what our default font size is going to be. We're just saying 100%. It also helps us get around some tricky rendering errors in Internet Explorer, so it's a good idea to go ahead and use percentages when you're working with the body tag. Now for color, I'm just going to go ahead and type in #666, which is a dark gray. So now we're going to have Georgia Times New Roman Times or Serif as our font. Our font size is going to be 100% of whatever the user agent's default font size is going to be. And then for color, we're using sort of a dark gray. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And notice how everything on my page changed. The headings and the paragraphs. They all inherited those values. So our headings are 100% of the size that they would normally be. The paragraphs are 100% of the size that they would normally be. They're all using the font Georgia, and they're all that dark gray. So now we get a little bit more specific by targeting those specific elements that are still on the page. In this case, we're going to do the heading 1. So I'll go right back to my CSS Styles panel. I'll click on New CSS Rule. And once again, I'm going to go to Tag for my selector type. And once again, I'm going to choose H1 or type in H1 for my selector name. So all you have to know is the name of the tag that you're controlling and type it in right there after you've chosen Tag from the pull-down menu. Once again, for rule definition, make sure it says this document only and click OK. Now here, we're going to make some changes. Maybe I would like my document site-wide to be in Georgia, but for my headings, I might want those to be in a sans serif font. So I can actually overwrite what the body tag is doing by telling the heading 1 tags, no, you need to be Arial. So go ahead and grab your font family pull-down menu and choose Arial. Currently, right now, we're telling our headings to be their default size because the body tag just basically said be 100% of what you would normally be. But if you want to take more control over that, you can. For font size for my headings, for example, I'm going to tell it to be 1.2, and then I'm just going to type in EM for M's. If you hit Tab, you can see that in the pull-down menu there. So we're going to discuss M's in more detail when we talk about units of measurement in just a little bit. Just understand that M's are a relative unit of measurement that once again is basically telling a heading be relative to the size that you would normally be in the user agent. We're also going to change the color of our headings. So I'm going to go right in the color dialog box and type in #600, which is sort of a deep burgundy color. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now take a look at what happens to my headings. They shrink down a little bit, they change color, and they change fonts. So we're still inheriting some of the things from the body tag, but for the most part, we almost did a total overwrite with our heading 1 styles. Now, the whole concept of using inheritance means that you don't have to write a lot of styles for your child tags. So we're going to write a style for our paragraph selector, but we're really not going to have to do a lot with it. So I'm going to go right over to my CSS Styles panel, choose New CSS Rule. Once again, I'm going to choose Tag from the pull-down menu, and I'm just going to type in P for paragraph. Make sure it's referring to this document only, and click OK. Now, our paragraphs are the font we need them to be, and they're the color we need them to be. They're inheriting that from the body tag. So all we need to do is change the size. So I'm going to make the size 1.2 M's, EM, and go ahead and click OK. Now, our headings are 1.2 M's, and our paragraphs are 1.2 M's as well. They're pretty much the same size, and that's kind of cool. You get to take control over the sizing of elements. As a matter of fact, if you really felt like it, you could make your paragraphs larger than your headings. It's really up to you when you're working with CSS. If you've taken a moment to scan and read the text that's on the page, you can see that some of the text needs styling that doesn't match what we've just done. If we were limited to just tag or element selectors, we wouldn't be able to achieve this. Now, thankfully, we have additional selectors available to us, and we'll use one of those, the class selector, in our next movie. If you're used to using Word, InDesign, or Quark to create styles, you're going to be really familiar with the concept of using class styles. Class selectors allow you to create a style with any name that you want. Any element that has that name as a class attribute is then styled with that formatting. The pros of using class selectors are that you can use them as often as you need, as many times as you need them on any given page. The downside is that you have to apply them manually, so they took a little bit more effort to apply at first when compared to element selectors. Usually, when most graphic designers begin working in web design, this is the type of selector they most often turn to achieve targeted formatting. You need to be careful when using class selections, however. Often designers will use them simply because they don't know of another and usually more efficient way to achieve the desired styling. This can cause an overabundance of class attributes in your code that don't really have any identifiable logic to them. So here we have the class selectors.htm from the 0609 folder open up. And there are a couple of things on the page that it's telling me it wants to do. For example, This paragraph right here says this is also a paragraph, but I want it to look different than the other two. We'll have to see how we can do that. Well, class selectors are an excellent way of doing that. And the paragraph right below it says this is another paragraph, and I want it to look the same as all my other paragraphs, but I want the word alone to look a little different, so we're going to have to figure out how to do that as well. Well, let's target our paragraph first. Now, again, class selectors are kind of a two-part process. You create the class selector, and then you apply it. So I'm going to go right over to my CSS Styles panel. I'm going to click to create a new CSS rule. And this time from the selector type, I'm going to choose class. And if class didn't come up automatically, you can just grab the pull-down menu and choose it. It's the first option there. Okay, so now we need to create our selector name. Now before, when we were creating element selectors, we had a pull-down menu that we could choose from. But now that pull-down menu doesn't do anything for us. The reason for that, our class names are defined by you. You come up with them. So I want to create a class called green text. That's fairly descriptive. So I'm going to type in period, lowercase g, green, uppercase T, text. Okay. So let's talk about the naming conventions of class selectors. First, class selectors need to start with this period right there. Please don't forget that. If you forget it, Dreamweaver will often save you a little bit by going ahead and placing it there for you, but you do not want to get in the habit of doing that. Because if you begin to hand code your text and you leave it off, well, you just don't have a selector at all. So remember, class selectors start with that period. The next thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that your names don't have any spaces in them. You can use underscores, you can use numbers, but you don't want to start off with a number, but avoid punctuation. Basically, just follow your standard naming conventions. No spaces, don't use any punctuation, and you can either use camel case naming, which I've named here, lowercase g, uppercase T, or underscores. Now again, I'm going to apply this rule to this document only, and I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. I'm going to change my font size to 1M, and then I'm going to change my color to a green, and the easiest green for me is just pound 060. If you type in some hexadecimal values and hit tab, you can see the color that you're going to get. You may be wondering why I'm using only 3 characters, because if you peruse through the swatch panel that they give us, we get 3 characters, but often you're going to see hexadecimal values represented as 6 characters. So what gives there? Well, these 3 characters, 060, is exactly the same as 006600. So it's just a way of shorthanding those hexadecimal values if you're working with similar pairs. You can just type in 060 to represent those pairs. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and nothing on my page changes. Well, remember, class selectors are a two-part process. In the first part, you create the selector. Second part, you apply it. So let's take a look at how we could do that. So I'm going to go ahead and select that paragraph that says this is also a paragraph, but I want it to look different than the other two. Just clicking in it will focus on that element, but if you want to be absolutely sure that you've selected the paragraph, use the tag selector. Remember, the tag selector can be found right down here below the document window. Hover over your paragraph and click once. All your text will highlight, but more importantly, you've selected the actual tag itself. Okay. Now, I'm actually going to switch over to my HTML properties. That may seem a little weird to you. Like, why are we switching to that? Well, because the class attribute is actually an HTML property. You're going to see as soon as we apply this, when we look at the code, that what's going to happen is our paragraph is now going to have a class attribute. The value of that will match what you have in your styles, and that's what's going to give you your styling. So for my class pull-down menu here, I'm going to grab that, and the only thing that I see is the only class that we've created so far, green text. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. So you can see this paragraph is a little larger than the other ones, but it's also green text. So now it looks totally different from the rest of the paragraphs, and that's all due to the class that we've applied to it. Now, let's take a look at code to see exactly what happened. I'm going to switch to a split screen view, and here I can see my source code. And right there is my paragraph, and right there is the class attribute. So that's how your browser is going to know which class selector you're wanting to apply there. So in that case, green text. All right, let's do this one more time so that we can see a slightly different way to apply styles. I'm going to go ahead and create another new CSS rule. Again, I'm going to do a class, and this time I'm going to do dot highlight. So dot highlight, all one word. Make sure it's this document only. And by the way, there is no space between the dot and the selector name. So dot highlight is all one word. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here, I'm really going to change some things up. And feel free to play around with these styles. If you want to Experiment with a property to see what it's going to do. No harm, no foul. You're not going to break anything. Just go in there and have a little bit of fun. I'm going to change font style to italic. I'm going to set color to #000, which is black. And then I'm going to switch over to the background category. So in my background category, I'm going to choose a background color of #FF0. And that is yellow. So this is going to put a yellow background behind that text to make it look like it's been highlighted. We're going to put a little padding so that we have a little bit of space all around our text as well. So I'm going to go down to the box category on the left-hand side there. And for padding, I'm going to turn off same for all. I'm going to do 2 pixels of padding to the top and to the bottom, and 5 pixels of padding to the right and to the left. So 2, 5, 2, 5. All right, again, I'm going to click OK. And once again, as we mentioned before, nothing changes. And that is, of course, because we have to apply the class. Now, before we wanted to do it to an entire paragraph. Well, that was pretty easy. We just take the paragraph tag and we apply a class attribute to it. But what about this word? This word is alone. It's all by itself. It's actually part of the paragraph. So if we apply the class highlight to that paragraph, the entire paragraph will get highlighted. So how can we choose just that one word and apply that class? Well, let's see. If I go down to my properties inspector, and once again, I'm looking at my HTML properties, I can now grab on the pull-down menu for class and choose highlight. Now, if I deselect that, I can see that it worked. Our word alone is now highlighted with that yellow highlight color. It's italicized and black. So we were entirely successful, but what happened behind the scenes? Well, again, I'm going to switch over to code view, and I can see that that word alone was surrounded by a span tag. Now, spans are generic inline level tags. Browsers don't render them at all. But what they allow us to do is surround words, individual characters, or entire passages, and then use the class or ID attribute to set that word apart and say that there's something special about it. In this case, we applied the class attribute highlight to it. So as you can see, class styles are great for targeting specific instances of styling and addressing them. Now, as I previously mentioned, and this is really important, you want to be careful about overusing classes. Classes should be used either when no other means of styling the text exists or when the class attribute is being used to add a meaningful name to the element. So learning how to target styles through descendant selectors that we're going to cover in just a little bit and ID selectors will be extremely helpful in making sure that you're not using or overusing your class selectors. ID selectors are very similar to class selectors. So similar, in fact, that many people get them confused. Class selectors, as we've seen, target the class attribute. ID selectors, on the other hand, target the ID attribute. Unlike class selectors, which can be used as many times on a page as you need, ID selectors can only be used once per page. That stems from the fact that each ID on a page must be unique. This is one of the reasons that people use IDs to typically identify areas of content. You will probably only have, for example, one header, one footer, that sort of thing. Now, it could seem like ID selectors are less powerful than class selectors due to the fact that they can only be used once per page, but that's actually wrong. ID selectors are much more powerful than class selectors and will overwrite the class selectors if their styles conflict with each other. This is a concept called specificity, and it basically says that the most specific rule wins in the event of a conflict. Since there can be only one element with an ID of header, for example, ID selectors tend to be very, very specific. So here we have ID_selectors from the 0610 folder open. And I want to talk about some of the structure that we have existing on the page already. So I'm just going to go ahead and switch to split screen view. And I notice when I place my cursor into this area, I see a little dotted line around it. Now, typically, that means that this is a div tag. If I select that in my code, I can see that we have a div and it has an ID of top. Well, we also have another div tag down here at the bottom, and it has an ID of, you guessed it, bottom. So we have an ID of top and an ID of bottom. And we can use those ID attributes to write ID selectors that are going to style those particular areas. And we can take advantage of those ID attributes by writing ID selectors that are going to style those regions on our page. I'll switch back to design view, go over to my CSS styles panel, and go ahead and click to create a new CSS rule. Now again, this time we need to choose our selector type. I'm going to grab the pull down menu and I'm going to choose ID. Now, if you remembered from our class selectors need to be preceded by a period. Well, IDs need to be preceded by a character as well, but they need to be preceded by the hash mark. That's also called an octothorpe character, but I prefer hash mark. So I'm just going to type in pound or hash mark or octothorpe, whatever you want to call it, that character, and then the word top. So that's how we write an ID selector to target that particular area on the page, pound top. Now remember, we're going to define it in this document only, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, because the ID attribute top is applied to a div tag, any styling we do here is going to affect the entire div tag and some of the content inside of it. So first thing I'm going to do is switch to my background category, and I'm going to give this div tag a background color. I'm going to type in pound CC9. Now, because our div tag already has the ID attribute applied to it, if you wanted to see what that was going to look like, you could go right down here to this apply button and click. You can see the background color show up within that div tag. So it's kind of nice that you can preview these before you commit to them. Now I'm also going to go to my box category, and for padding, I'm going to leave same for all checked, and I'm going to type in 10 pixels. Now if you notice, if you click apply, padding basically gives you a little bit of cushion between the edge of the element and the content inside of it. So that creates more of a box look to this, and the text isn't butting up right against the edge of the div tag. We can also set a width here, and I'm going to set the width of this div tag to 450 pixels. It's going to shorten it a little bit, and again, make this look more like a little box. Now I'm going to go to my border category, and for my border, I'm going to choose this style, width, and color, same for all. I'm going to go ahead and do a style of solid, a width of 1 pixel, and for color, I'm going to type in pound 600, which if you remember is that burgundy color. I'll go ahead and click OK. And that finishes the styling of that region. If I switch over to live view so that we can see this a little bit better, you can see that the div tag now is smaller in size because we gave it a fixed width. We gave it a border all the way around it, a background color, and some padding to keep the text away from it. This is a really good way to create sidebars or call out tags or things like that. I'm going to turn live view off, and now let's go ahead and create the selector for the bottom div tag. So again, I'm going to create a new CSS rule. I'm going to do an ID selector, and the ID selector is going to be named pound bottom, and we're going to define it in this document only. Remember, there's no space between the pound symbol and the name, so pound bottom. Go ahead and click OK. And here we're going to make some changes that are a little bit more specific than the changes we made above us. First off, we're going to change the font family to Arial. We're going to change the foreground color to pound FFF, which is white. Then we're going to go to our background, change the background color to pound 666, which is that dark gray. And then we're also going to give it width and padding as well. I'm going to go to my box properties, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a width of 450 pixels and give it a padding of 10, just like we did before. Now, if I click apply, I can preview what this is going to look like, and I can click OK. Now, notice that we have a slightly different change here. Do you see how our paragraphs went from being Times New Roman to Arial? That's because they are now inheriting that font value not from the body tag, which is further up the document tree, but now from this div tag, which is much closer to them and has a higher degree of specificity. So we've styled two distinct regions using the power of ID selectors. Note how the specificity overrode some of the existing styling and how inheritance cascaded the formatting down into the child elements. In this case, the Arial font is a good example of that. These are both extremely important concepts to understand as you begin writing your own CSS. So far, we've used all three basic selector types: element, class, and ID. Now, while those three will serve as the building blocks for almost every style you write in your CSS, their application will be incomplete without also understanding how to write descendant selectors. I do not exaggerate when I say that over 90% of the styles in your site will be descendant selectors. Descendant selectors target rules based on where an element is found within another element. To target every span tag inside of a paragraph tag, you would only need to write the selector p space span, for example. Descendant selectors are typically used in conjunction with ID selectors. This allows you to style all paragraphs in the sidebar so that they look different than the main content. Let's create a couple of descendant selectors to finish styling our sample page. So here we have the descendant selectors.html file. Now, just to kind of refresh your memory about the structure of the page, remember we have a div tag up top with an ID of top, and we have a div tag down at the bottom of the page with an ID of bottom. In between those, we have two paragraphs, one that has a class attribute of green text and one that is just a normal paragraph. Well, let's say we want to target the paragraphs just in this top region. Style these guys separately without affecting any other content. If we didn't know about descendant selectors, we would probably be trying to use a class selector to do that. So this is one of those instances where I want to point out how much more efficient a descendant selector is over a class selector. So we're going to do a brand new CSS rule. And this time, we're not going to choose any of the first three options of selector type. We're going to choose the last one, which is compound. Now, compound is Dreamweaver's way of basically just saying whatever you want to write. Now, you'll notice that my selector has already resolved itself for me. That was nice of Dreamweaver. Pound top, space P. That's exactly the descendant selector I need to write. Now, how did it know to do that? Well, because I selected this paragraph within this region. So when I selected compound, Dreamweaver basically wrote a compound selector for me based on that area. Now, it's not always going to get it right, so don't rely on Dreamweaver to write these selectors for you. Look at it more of a way of saving a little bit of time. Now, if you need to write that yourself, remember, just do pound top, and this is the important part, space P. That space indicates that you're moving from one element to another. So we're looking for any paragraph inside of any region with an ID of top. Again, we're going to do it in this document only, and we're going to go ahead and click OK. So for color here, I'm going to type in pound 000. For font size, I'm going to type in 1M. And then for font style, I'm going to italicize that text. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And notice that my paragraphs in the top region restyle. So unlike a class selector, I don't have to do any manual application whatsoever. I'm just telling my browser, look inside any region with an ID of top. If you find a paragraph inside that, style it like this. So we're targeting very specific areas. Now let's tackle the heading 1 in our bottom region. If we looked at this on a page again and we said, hey, we want this heading to look slightly different than any other heading on the page. Again, a lot of people would resort to a class selector, but we can use the structure of the page to our advantage. We notice that this is the only heading 1 and the only one inside of a region with an ID of bottom. So we're going to use that to write our descendant selector. Once again, I'm going to choose new CSS rule. I'm going to make sure it says compound, and once again, because I placed my cursor into that element, you'll notice that Dreamweaver resolved it for me. Pound bottom space H1. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, making sure it's being defined in this document only. And for color, I'm going to choose pound FF0, which is a yellow color. For font size, I'm going to choose 1.6 ems, so maybe a good bit larger there. Font weight is going to be normal, so headings are normally bold, so by changing font weight to normal, this particular heading will not be bold. And for line height, I'm going to choose 1.2, and we're going to do a multiple. Now again, later on in Chapter 7, when we do typography, we'll go into what a multiple, what an M is, those things in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and now I see the heading looks totally different than the one above it, and no class selectors are involved in that at all. Now finally, we've been using IDs for our descendant selectors, and they're commonly found within descendant selectors, but you don't have to use them. You can use any selectors you want to do a descendant selector. You can also do more than two. You can have as many elements as you want in a row. So you could say body, space form, space table, space paragraph. And that would target any paragraph inside of a table, inside of a form, inside of the body tag. So you can go as deep into that as you want. Let's go ahead and do another new CSS rule. Now again, this time I'm going to choose compound. And because I didn't have anything focused on the page, I now have to write this compound selector myself. Now again, don't be confused by the term compound versus descendant. Descendant selectors are also sometimes referred as contextual selectors. The word compound here really doesn't have any meaning to CSS. In Dreamweaver, it just basically means you can do something beyond the basic 3 types of selectors. So for selector name here, I'm going to type in body, and then space. Remember that space is important. And then P, and then space, and then span. Now I want to point out something else that Dreamweaver is doing for us here. If you're learning how to write these selectors, there's a really nice tool that Dreamweaver has given you guys right below the name of the selector. Notice that it says this selector name will apply your rule to all span elements that are within any paragraph elements that are within any body elements. So if you write a descendant selector, you're going to get a description down below it of what you're going to be targeting. If that reads a little bit different than your intent, then perhaps your selector needs a little bit of refinement. Now again, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. I'm going to make a very simple change to this. I'm just going to change the font weight to bold and then click OK. Again, notice the word alone is now bold because it is in a span tag, which is also inside the body tag. Perfect. Now, this page is not going to win any design contest, but we've successfully created individual looks for each element based on its position and type. Once you do a few descendant selectors, it's very easy to see how powerful and how useful they are. You'll find they control an overwhelming majority of the styling in your sites, properly structuring and naming elements inside your site, and consistently using those standards makes it easy to create descendant selectors that do all the work for you, eliminating the need to rely on class selectors for everything that you do. So how do you go about getting your styles into an external style sheet and then attaching them to the page? Dreamweaver makes the process pretty seamless and gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility and control. Whenever you create a new rule, Dreamweaver gives you the option of where to place those rules. You can place them in a new style sheet, which will then prompt you to create a new one, place the rule in an existing style sheet if you already have one attached, or simply embed the rule in the current page, which would restrict it to only the current document. In this movie, we'll start by attaching an existing style sheet to our page, and then experiment with ways to move a rule from one style sheet to another. So I have the index page from the 0612 folder open up, and it looks unstyled except for one thing. This headline, Explore Our World Your Way, looks like it's been styled. And if I look over at the CSS Styles panel, indeed I can see that I have a rule, pound main content space H1. This is an embedded style. I know that because instead of the name of the external style sheet, I just have that style tag right there. I can also look in my source code. If I scroll up, there's my embedded style right in the head of the document. Okay, cool. So how do we create external style sheets? Well, one of the easiest ways to do it is just in the normal process of creating your CSS. So let's say we were going to create an overall rule for our body tag. If I come over here to the CSS Styles panel and I choose New CSS Rule, and I do Tag and I choose Body, notice that one of my options is to do a new style sheet file. So if I choose New Style Sheet File and click OK, instead of bringing up the CSS Rule Definition dialog box, what I get is something prompting me to save a brand new style sheet. So here I could browse to where I wanted to put it, give it a name, and I would click OK or Save. Now what that's going to do for me is it would create a brand new external style sheet, it would link it to this page, and it would place the new rule inside that style sheet, and it would do it all in one step. So that's pretty cool. Now, we happen to have an existing external style sheet that we need to use, so we don't really need to do this step, so I'm just going to select Cancel, and we'll go back to our page the way it was. Okay, so if I look over at the CSS Styles panel, another option that I have is this little link option, and it's right beside the new CSS rule icon. If you hover over it, you'll get a little tooltip that comes up that tells you that that is Attach Style Sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And that brings up a dialog box that says, okay, you want to attach an external style sheet. Where can I find this? So I'm going to go ahead and select Browse. So I'm going to browse inside my 0612 folder. I'm going to find my CSS folder, open that up, and I want to link to this main.css. I'm going to click OK there. I'm going to bring it in and add it as a link. I've got two choices there, link and import. Import brings it in using @import, which was great for really old browsers that we don't use anymore, or as a way of creating more modular style sheets. The more common means of doing this is with link, and that's what we're going to do. We're also able to choose a media type here, and I find this pretty interesting. You have a pull-down menu, and you can choose between all these different media types. Now, since we're going to be doing this for our web browser, we're going to use the screen media type, but I'm also going to type in comma projection. So you can actually string multiple media types together if you'd like. These styles will apply to any device that requests for the screen media type or the projection media type. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and it attaches our style sheet. Now, I noticed a problem just by looking over at my CSS Styles panel. The CSS Styles panel gives us a lot of information that you might not really understand unless you're paying attention to it. Notice, for example, the style tag is on top of the main.css. That means that our embedded styles are literally on top of the external style sheet. You're probably saying to yourself, yeah, so what? Well, those styles are applied in the order that they're found. So if your external styles are found prior to your embedded styles, that means that the external styles are actually going to overwrite the embedded styles if those two don't agree with each other. That would be a problem. So we're going to need to move those around a little bit. Now, I do want you to pay attention to what happened to our page. we went from this sort of bland, ugly, just sort of text to a fairly nice layout. And all that happened just by attaching that external style sheet. Now, if I go over to the code view of my page, you can see why our main.css is listing under style. Now, this is one of the things that I wish they would change in Dreamweaver. I love the program, but occasionally there are some things that you're like, I really wish it did a different way. We really ought to have the option of choosing where within the head to place that link tag, but we don't. So one of the things you might want to do, create a blank line above your embedded styles. You can grab that link tag and just drag it up so that it's actually above the embedded styles. That is how you want that. You want any external styles to come first in your code and then your embedded styles to come after that. So take a moment or two to do that in code view. Just be really careful about doing it. Make sure you're not leaving behind any of the tags. Make sure you're not replacing any of the existing tags. I'm going to switch back to design view, save my file. And now if I look over my CSS styles panel, there are my external styles. There are my embedded styles. Now, what happens if you decide that you want an embedded style to literally become something that is global throughout your site? It's not uncommon, for example, let's say you have a site with 100 pages on it, and you just want to test something locally on a page before committing it to your entire site. So maybe you write an embedded style or two, kind of play around with it on that page, and then suddenly somebody might say, or you might even say yourself, you know what, that really ought to look that way across the entire site. Well, does that mean you have to rewrite those selectors? Absolutely not. You can move selectors from one style sheet to another. Let me show you how to do that. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the files panel by double-clicking that. Again, that's just going to give me a little bit more room, and I can even grab this divider, move it down a little bit so that I can see these styles a little better. Now, there's a lot going on here, but you can kind of see the way that these selectors are arranged. We have our main content selectors, our base navigation selectors, so they're all sort of grouped together. Honestly, the pound main content H1 that we've got would probably fit right around this area, so it'd be kind of nice if it was there. All right, so how can we do that? Well, I'm going to scroll down, grab this main content H1, literally just hold my mouse down on it and drag. And I'm just going to scroll up without letting go of the mouse until I find, I'm not quite there yet, that main content space P selector that I was talking about. There we go. So I would like it to appear either right above or right below that. So I'm just going to drag it to right above that. I'm going to let go. There it is. So I've moved it to my external style sheet, placed it exactly where I wanted it in that style sheet in terms of organization, and moved it away from my embedded style. So you can see the embedded styles are now empty. The rule has physically been removed from our page and placed in that external style sheet. I can collapse the external style sheet, select my now empty and unused embedded style tag, and when I have that selected and focused on, I can click the trash can to go ahead and delete that from our code. So now the only thing that we have in our page is our external style sheets. Pretty cool. So as you can see, creating new style sheets, attaching them to your pages, and moving styles from one style sheet to another is extremely easy in Dreamweaver. The power of the CSS Styles panel makes it simple to deploy your styles across your site exactly as your site strategy dictates.